The boutique gleamed with an air of refined exclusivity. Polished floors reflected the soft, golden glow of strategically placed lights, while rows of carefully curated designer pieces stood on display, each an invitation to indulge in luxury. Affluent customers, dressed in tailored suits and elegant dresses, strolled leisurely through the aisles, their quiet sophistication a testament to the store's elite reputation. Soft murmurs of conversation blended with the faint hum of classical music playing in the background, creating an atmosphere of serene opulence. Behind the counter stood Martin Caldwell, the proud proprietor of the boutique. Every detail of his appearance, from his perfectly knotted tie to his impeccably pressed suit, exuded professionalism and precision. Martin had worked tirelessly to build the store into what it was today, a sanctuary of high-end fashion and prestige, attracting only the most appropriate clientele. His sharp, calculating gaze swept over the room, ensuring that everything, from the placement of a display to the demeanor of his staff, aligned with his vision of perfection. The soft chime of the door broke Martin's train of thought. He looked up and immediately noticed the man who had just entered. Unlike the usual patrons, this customer didn't fit the mold. He was a middle-aged black man, dressed in a loose hoodie, sneakers, and glasses. The casual attire clashed starkly with the boutique's sophisticated ambiance. Martin's eyes narrowed slightly, the briefest flicker of judgment crossing his face. The man walked in with a calm, assured demeanor, his steps measured as he took in his surroundings. He didn't rush or hesitate, his movements suggesting he belonged wherever he chose to be, despite the unspoken exclusivity that permeated the boutique. His gaze was observant, almost as though he were studying the space and the people within it. Martin straightened his posture and stepped out from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but tinged with skepticism. The man turned to him, offering a small nod. "Just browsing, thank you," he said simply, his tone calm and composed. As the man began to move through the store, Martin's eyes followed him closely. He noticed how the man's fingers lingered over a leather briefcase, examining its fine craftsmanship with quiet appreciation. A subtle unease crept into Martin's demeanor. He exchanged a glance with one of his employees, who raised an eyebrow as if to ask whether she should intervene. Martin gave a slight shake of his head and decided to approach the man again. "That collection over there," Martin said, gesturing toward a display of handbags and accessories, "is part of our limited edition line. Exquisite craftsmanship, quite exclusive." The man paused and looked at Martin, his expression unreadable. "Exclusive?" he repeated, his tone neutral yet laced with a hint of curiosity. Martin hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "Yes, it's a significant investment. Not for everyone, you see." The man's eyes lingered on Martin for a moment before he spoke. "Craftsmanship like this deserves to be appreciated," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Of course," Martin replied, forcing a smile. Yet his discomfort was now palpable, and he found himself unsure of how to steer the conversation. The man turned back to the briefcase, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather. "It's interesting," he said after a moment, his voice calm but deliberate. "How easily we make assumptions." Martin stiffened slightly. "I'm not sure I follow," he said cautiously. The man gave a faint smile, his eyes meeting Martin's. "A place like this, you expect certain things, certain people, and when something doesn't fit—" He let the sentence hang in the air, the weight of his words settling between them. Martin's throat tightened. "We welcome all customers," he said, his tone firm but defensive. "Do you?" the man asked quietly, his gaze steady. His words were not accusatory, but they carried a weight that Martin couldn't ignore. For a moment, there was silence between them. The ambient sounds of the boutique seemed to fade, leaving only the tension of the unspoken conversation. Martin felt an unfamiliar unease gnawing at him, as though he were being seen in a way he wasn't used to. The man straightened and gave Martin a small nod. "Thank you for your time," he said simply, turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Martin remained rooted to the spot. His thoughts churned, replaying the brief exchange in his mind. For the first time, he felt a crack in his carefully curated sense of control, a nagging doubt about what had just transpired. The man moved through the boutique with a calm assurance, his every step measured and deliberate. His gaze lingered on the finely crafted leather bags and high-end accessories, his fingers occasionally brushing against the polished surfaces as though appreciating the artistry behind them. His demeanor was quiet yet confident, as if he belonged wherever he chose to be. Martin, however, stood behind the counter, his gaze sharp and critical. Something about the man unsettled him. Not his actions, but his presence. He adjusted his tie and stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. "We have some exclusive pieces here," Martin began, his voice polite yet carrying an unmistakable edge. "Limited collections. Quite a statement for the right buyer." The man glanced at Martin, a faint smile touching his lips. "Quality speaks for itself," he replied evenly, his tone steady but holding an unspoken strength. Martin's jaw tightened. He took a step closer, folding his hands behind his back. "You're right about that," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "Though, I should mention, these items are premium. Not everyone is comfortable with the price point." The man's expression didn't change. If the comment stung, he didn't show it. Instead, he replied with quiet precision. "A fair price for craftsmanship isn't an issue for someone who values it." Martin blinked, caught off guard by the man's composure. The air between them seemed to thicken. A couple of customers paused their browsing, their eyes darting toward the interaction. Most looked away, unwilling to involve themselves, but a few cast subtle glances at the man, their expressions laced with curiosity and silent judgment. "Do you need help finding anything specific?" Martin asked, his tone betraying an undertone of impatience. "No, thank you," the man replied calmly. He reached for a briefcase, inspecting it with the same measured ease that had characterized his every move. Martin let out a short breath, his voice growing colder. "Browsing is one thing," he said, lowering his voice, "but we prefer to keep the atmosphere professional. I wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The man looked up, his gaze steady. "What makes you think I don't belong here?" The question was simple, yet it cut deeper than Martin expected. His face tightened, but he didn't respond. Another customer shuffled uncomfortably nearby, turning away as though the tension wasn't her concern. "I have every right to be here," the man continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "The same as anyone else." Martin's face flushed. "If you're not purchasing anything, I'll have to ask you to leave. We can't have anyone disturbing the atmosphere." "Disturbing?" The man's eyebrows lifted slightly. "By browsing?" Martin didn't answer directly. "I have to maintain a certain standard here," he said curtly, his voice rising slightly. The man straightened, his posture unyielding. "And what standard is that exactly?" Martin's lips parted, but no words came out. The weight of the question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. After a long pause, the man sighed and began walking toward the door. As he reached it, he paused, turning back to face Martin. His voice was quiet, yet it carried through the room with unmistakable clarity. "It's unfortunate when people see only what they want to see," he said, holding Martin's gaze. The room fell silent. Customers froze, the weight of the words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Even Martin found himself unable to speak. The man turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with discomfort and unspoken truths. Martin stood motionless, his hands trembling slightly. His mind replayed the interaction in vivid detail, each word echoing in his thoughts. He looked around the boutique, seeing the unease on the faces of his staff and customers. A bitter taste filled his mouth. For the first time, Martin felt the sting of his own assumptions. Yet, even as he stood there, he refused to admit it. The cracks in his resolve too fresh, too fragile to confront. The moment lingered in the room, a stark reminder of the silent but pervasive barriers built on prejudice and privilege. The boutique buzzed with the lively chatter of new arrivals. A group of well-dressed customers strolled in, their voices filled with excitement. "Did you hear? Denzel Washington's filming right nearby," one of them exclaimed, gesturing animatedly. "They say he loves blending into crowds. You'd never recognize him if he didn't want you to." Martin's ears perked up at the mention of the actor. His thoughts drifted back to the man he had dismissed earlier. The calm confidence, the poised demeanor, the quiet but commanding presence. Little details began to click into place, each one adding weight to his growing suspicion. Could it have been him? His breath quickened as the realization sank in. The man he had so blatantly judged and dismissed wasn't just a stranger. He was Denzel Washington, a name synonymous with excellence and respect. A pang of regret surged through Martin as flashes of his earlier behavior replayed in his mind. The sharp comments, the veiled insults, the insistence that he didn't belong. Each memory now carried a sting of shame. Outside, the energy was palpable. A small crowd had gathered, their phones at the ready, hoping for a glimpse of the actor. Martin stood behind the glass, watching as people buzzed with anticipation. His heart sank further. The weight of his prejudice, so casually wielded earlier, now felt unbearable. He paced back and forth, his mind racing. Apologizing was the right thing to do, he knew that much. But how could he face the man he had wronged so deeply? His hands trembled as he imagined the confrontation, each possible response fueling his growing anxiety. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, Martin stepped outside. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on him. Denzel stood a few feet away, dressed as casually as before, speaking warmly with a small group of fans. His smile was genuine, his demeanor unshaken. Martin's heart pounded as he approached, his steps hesitant but determined. When he reached Denzel, the words caught in his throat. For a moment, he simply stood there, his discomfort evident. I need to apologize," he finally managed, his voice trembling. "I didn't recognize you earlier, but that doesn't excuse my behavior. I was wrong, completely wrong. I judged you unfairly, and I treated you in a way that no one deserves." Denzel turned to face him fully, his calm gaze meeting Martin's nervous eyes. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet strength that made Martin feel even smaller. "I don't need to be recognized for respect," Denzel said, his tone even but firm. "And neither does anyone else." Martin's head dropped, the truth of the words hitting him like a blow. "I let my assumptions guide me," he admitted, "and I'm ashamed of how I acted. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it." Denzel paused, letting the words linger before he spoke again. "It's not about me forgiving you," he said. It's about what you do next. Prejudice doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end, it diminishes the person carrying it. You have a choice now. You can let this moment teach you something, or you can let it pass and stay the same. Martin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'll do better. I have to do better." Denzel's gaze softened slightly, though his words remained pointed. Change isn't just about saying the right things. It's about actions. The way you treat people when no one's watching. That's where it matters. The crowd around them had fallen silent, their earlier excitement replaced with quiet reflection. Denzel's words carried an undeniable weight, touching not just Martin, but everyone within earshot. Martin swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "For your patience, for your grace." Denzel gave him a small nod, a gesture that carried both understanding and expectation. Then, turning back to the crowd, he resumed his conversation as though nothing had happened. Martin stood there for a moment longer, the crowd bustling around him. He felt exposed, raw, but also oddly lighter. As he turned to walk back into the store, he resolved to let this moment define not just his regret, but his future actions. Martin stood in the quiet of his store, the shelves lined with luxury items that now seemed to reflect his own shallow judgments. His gaze dropped to his hands, resting on the polished counter. The same hands that had gestured dismissively at a man who deserved better. Regret weighed heavily on him, a constant echo of Denzel's calm but cutting words. It's unfortunate when people see only what they want to see. Hours passed, but the knot in his chest refused to loosen. Each memory of his actions stung afresh. It wasn't just about being wrong. It was about the harm his prejudice had caused, not only to Denzel but to anyone who had ever walked into his store and felt the sting of judgment. "I can't stay this way," Martin murmured to himself. His voice wavered, but the resolve was clear. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, searching for ways to educate himself. Within minutes, he found a local diversity and inclusion workshop. His mouse hovered over the registration button, hesitation creeping in. What if people saw him there? What would they think? Shaking his head, he pushed the thought aside and clicked. Change required more than regret. It demanded action. Days later, Martin took another step. He reached out to community organizations to recruit staff from diverse backgrounds, seeking people who could bring fresh perspectives to his boutique. Each conversation was a humbling experience, a reminder of how limited his world had been. His next decision was even harder. Sitting at the counter late one evening, he drafted a heartfelt post for the store's social media. "I need to address something deeply personal. Recently, my behavior reflected a prejudice that has no place in my store or my life. I judged someone unfairly, and I'm ashamed of my actions. To those I hurt, directly or indirectly, I'm sorry. I am committed to learning and growing, not just for myself, but for everyone who walks through these doors. Change starts now." He hit post and closed his laptop, unsure of what the response would be. Overnight, the comments poured in. Some applauded his honesty, while others questioned his sincerity. Still, Martin knew this was only the beginning. Accountability meant more than words. It meant proving his intentions through consistent actions. Meanwhile, Denzel shared his own reflection on the incident in a quiet yet powerful way. His post read, "Empathy is a bridge. It allows us to see beyond what's on the surface. We all have a responsibility to cross that bridge, to challenge our assumptions and to listen. Change doesn't happen in a day, but it begins with a moment of awareness." The post gained traction. sparking conversations within the local community. Residents and business owners alike began hosting workshops and events focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What had started as an act of prejudice was now fueling change far beyond the boutique. Months later, Martin's store was a different place. The air felt lighter, the atmosphere warmer. New faces filled the aisles, customers from all walks of life browsing comfortably. One afternoon, a young black man hesitated at the entrance. His eyes darted nervously around the boutique before stepping inside. Martin noticed immediately. "Welcome," he said warmly, walking toward the man with an open smile. "Let me know if there's anything I can help you with." The customer's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded, venturing further into the store. As Martin watched him browse, Denzel's words played in his mind once more. It's unfortunate when people see only what they want to see. This time, the words didn't sting, they inspired. The store now stood as a symbol of transformation, proof that even the most ingrained biases could be unlearned. For Martin, it wasn't the end of the journey, but a hopeful new beginning.